Well, hello everyone and welcome to another programme in this Tributaries to the River Tweed series. And today we're looking at Ettrick Water. Now, a big hello to all my regular viewers and a warm welcome to anyone on this channel for the first time. So far in this series, the tributaries which have been featured have all been relatively short. In comparison, Ettrick Water, while still a tributary, is a substantial river in its own right and could be filmed as a series all on its own. The main focus though is on the Tweed, and these tributary programmes are merely there supporting the main series. So I don't want to spend too long on it and detract from that. Now, I'm doing this narrative at the confluence between the Ettrick and the Tweed. But as I've pointed out previously, I'm not a fell walker and have no ability to reach the source of Ettrick on foot. So this programme will begin at Roburn Farm, 6 miles from the river's source. The bit between Roburn and the actual source on Capel Fell is very remote, not accessed by a road, and really only the stealthiest of fell walkers were possibly able to reach it. Ettrick Water is 33 miles long, and that's a third of the length of the Tweed itself, and runs from Capel Fell, as I've just mentioned, situated in the Ettrick Hills, which is just northeast of Moffat, and joins the Tweed 3 miles west of Melrose. Ettrick Water is the second fastest Scottish river to rise after rainfall. Measures have been taken along its course to cope with the river bursting its banks, such as floodplains and retaining walls. From its source at Capel Fell, the first 10 miles of the river's course flows through Ettrick Valley, flanked by steep-sided hills and occasionally dotted with hill farms. The river winds its way down the valley until it reaches the next farm at Cossa's Hill Farm, which according to Google is now a holiday cottage rented out by ettrickholidays.co.uk. Only a mile further downriver is the secluded hamlet of Ettrick, which of course is where the name of the river comes from, as does Ettrick Forest and the Ettrick Hills. I'm doing the drone work today, but I just wanted to share a little bit of information with you that I've gleaned from talking to the farmers. And I've had this information before in some of the other valleys. In that all of this land that's being bought up by the forestry, once they get their hands on it and plant it with spruce, it ruins the land for pretty much ever, because they plant one lot of trees, they're chopped, and then they'll probably plant a second crop or maybe a third. But by the time they've done that, the land's left completely barren and desolate, and nothing else will grow there. So when you see from the drone footage high up, you can see these vast areas where the trees have been cut and it just looks dead and barren. And there's nothing the farmers can do. Of course, the land goes for 2 or 3 times its value, such as the money being pushed. But it means that the land would have to lie fallow for at least 100 years to even begin to regenerate, and then maybe another 100 years on top of that before it could be planted with, say, a deciduous forest or whatever. And of course, it was a deciduous forest that was here hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, when it was the Caledonian forest. And that, of course, because the leaves fall, nourishes the ground, and so it's quite a fertile land to be, to support all sorts of life. But as I say, I just wanted to share that with you because it's a story I've heard many times, and every time I come up one of these valleys, the farmers are telling me the same story. So as I say, I just wanted to share that with you. In 1235, a large area of the land here was given to the monks of Melrose Abbey by Alexander II. Today, Ettrick is a scattering of houses and a church, but in the late 1600s, there were 50 families living here. The village was called Ettrick Kirk back then. The landowners began clearing tenants from their lands from 1700 onwards in what is commonly known in Scottish history as the clearances. Up until that time, the residents in most of rural Scotland, including the borders, were crofters, earning their living by various small means, some with a few sheep, some with cattle, some were weavers, and some grew crops or vegetables. From 1700 onwards, when the woolen trade arrived in Scotland and especially the borders, this was not a profitable use of the land. So turning the land over to wool was more profitable. And so the landowners began clearing the tenants off the land to farm sheep. The kirk in the village was the focal point of the village for 800 years and still is. The kirkyard holds 3 key clues in the history of the church and the village by 3 people who are buried here. The first of those people is Thomas Boston, one of the preachers from the Covenanters movement. who initially scared most of the parishioners away. He produced a book of sermons which greatly influenced religious and political thinking at that time. He eventually won his popularity, and as many as 800 people would walk great distances to hear him preach. The second person buried here is James Hogg, who was a poet and novelist known locally as the Ettrick Shepherd. He wrote in the Scots Gaelic language and English. He was a shepherd boy born in 1770 and self-taught. He became one of the most admired writers of the day, best known today for his wonderfully titled novel, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. And the third person buried here is Tibby Shiel. Tibby is a derivative of Isabel. She was born in 1783 and lived with her husband and 6 children in a cottage overlooking St Mary's Loch, 5 miles west of here on the other side of the hill. On her husband's death, she supported herself and the 6 children alone by taking in lodgers. Today the cottage has been extended and is called Tibby Shiel's Inn, and it is still taking in travellers. The river continues winding its way down the valley for another 9 miles until it reaches Kirk. Here a single track road leads off to a viewpoint some 3 miles north. Halfway along this track is Kirk Tower. It is likely to have been built around the mid-1500s when wealthy landowners were required to build a peel tower on their land to protect against English invasion and the lawless border reivers. Ironically though, it belonged to the eldest son of one of the most infamous border reivers, Walter Scott of Harden, also known as Old Wat. He is mentioned in episode 7 of the main Tweed series. Today it is a private residence owned by Peter Clark, a former Conservative candidate and landowner here. He gave a guided tour of the interior to the BBC in 2008 in the series Castles in the Country. It is series 4, episode 6 if you wish to watch that. Following the river a mile further down its course, we reach Ettrick Bridge, which was originally called Kirkup after the tower until the late 1700s. The new name came from the bridge spanning the river, built in 1780. Prior to that, the river crossing here was simply a ford crossing. The road which passes through Ettrick Bridge today was the old coach road between Selkirk and Moffat. Coaches had to stop frequently to change horses and allow passengers to rest. A river crossing made an ideal location to break the journey, and therefore a settlement develops around that need. Ettrick Bridge grew further when the mills arrived in Selkirk, which was why the bridge was built. The road from Selkirk to Moffat via Langdale Muir is remote to say the least. Ettrick Bridge is the largest settlement on that route, even though it is relatively small. Two miles further downstream on the south side of the river is Auldwood Tower. Ettrick Forest covered most of the surrounding valleys here, and of course was once part of the Great Caledonian Forest. Ettrick Forest was owned by the monarchy of Scotland and used for hunting. It was given to the Scott clan for their loyalty to Robert the Bruce in 1322, and it remained in their ownership for 300 years. After the annihilation of the English troops at Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce continually raided northern England in the following years. Edward II, being a weak and ineffectual king, barely able to control his own nobles, tried to invade Scotland by marching an army on Edinburgh. Robert the Bruce withdrew his army north of the Forth Valley and removed all the cattle and burned the crops. As the English marched north, there was no food for them to forage, and so quickly starved and retreated, burning the abbeys at Melrose and Dryborough on their way back out of revenge. Robert the Bruce wasted no time and moved his army across the Solway Firth to Carlisle, coming down the west, and then moved east, surprising Edward's retreating army, and met them at Byland near York. The English positioned themselves for battle with a high cliff on their flank, thinking the Scots would not be able to attack from there. The Bruce had recruited Highland warriors used to fighting on rough terrain. As the Scots attacked from the high ground, the result was total annihilation of the English again. The battle was the Battle of Old Byland in 1322. It is one of their descendants living here in the 1600s who was involved in the incident at Elibank Castle mentioned in episode 7 of the main Tweed series, namely old Wat's son, Walter Scott. The famous Sir Walter Scott of Abbotsford House was a descendant of the marriage in that story. In the 1800s, the tower was leased to a tenant farmer and no longer lived in. Then in 1988, it became the home of Sir David Steele, the long-standing MP of the Borders, who later acquired the title of Lord Steele of Akewood. He had Scot blood, so keeping the ownership tradition alive. Today, his youngest son Rory and his wife have refurbished the tower, and it is available to hire for weddings or as a holiday home. A mile further downriver on the north side is Bow Hill House and Gardens. Although the house dates from 1812, the land here has been owned by the Scott clan as far back as 1116. This particular branch of the family is known as the Scots of Buccleuch. The name originates from the late 900s and is often misspelt and poorly pronounced. The legend tells of Kenneth III hunting deer in a deep, narrow ravine in Ettrick Forest. A ravine is called a cleugh in Scotland, and a young male deer is known as a buck. A young buck charged towards the king and was stopped by the king's servant called John Scott. He grabbed the deer's antlers and wrestled it to the ground, saving the king's life. The Scott clan were rewarded with lands for their heroics and became known as the Scots of Buccleuch. The house was expanded during the 1800s by architects William Atkinson, William Byrne and David Bryce. It was much admired by Sir Walter Scott, even though it lacks the baronial charm of Abbotsford. Today it remains a very popular attraction for visitors coming to the Borders. In 2 more miles we reach the very important border town of Selkirk, one of the oldest royal boroughs in Scotland. The name Selkirk means hall by the church. It was the site of the first abbey in the borders of Scotland, occupied by Tyrannensian monks and built by David I in 1113. It was Selkirk where William Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland in 1297. But the origins of Selkirk go back much further than those dates. The first settlers here were the Selgovi tribes, as mentioned in previous episodes. Around 500 AD, they were converted to Christianity, and the settlement we see today grew around the church built on the top of Peel Hill. That was developed into the abbey mentioned earlier by David I. However, in 1128 the monks moved to Kelso. Despite this setback, the town still continued to grow. Around the same time as the abbey was established, a motte and bailey castle was built on the south side of today's town. This became a royal castle in 1301, but apparently was destroyed in the build-up to the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The area is heavily overgrown with trees now, but if you look hard enough, the outline of the foundations can still be made out. Ettrick Forest was, of course, one of the many hiding places William Wallace used during his campaign to achieve independence from England. So it was fitting that after his success at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, he was made Guardian of Scotland here in Selkirk at the Kirk o' the Forest. The site was recently uncovered in the grounds of the old kirk, only a few hundred metres from the former castle. During the 1400s, Selkirk was trading via Berwick with the Baltic ports, having earned a reputation as shoemakers. The locals were referred to as suitors. My regular viewers will recall from the Durham series I made last year that the word suitor comes from an Old Norse word, suter, meaning shoemaker. However, the peace and prosperity only lasted until 1513, when James IV's ill-judged invasion of England resulted in the slaughter of many border people, including 79 men from Selkirk in the Battle of Flodden Field. Now that may not sound like many people, but that accounted for the majority of the men living in Selkirk at that time. If that wasn't bad enough for Selkirk, after the Battle of Flodden, the English proceeded north and sacked not only Selkirk but many of the border towns in revenge. A memorial to those lost at Flodden stands outside Victoria Hall in the town. A popular song ends with the line, "There's gallant suitors in Selkirk as long as there's water in the Tweed." The town was rebuilt and by the late 1500s re-established its shoemaking industry. But less than 50 years later, another battle took place much closer to Selkirk at Philiphof. Again, my long-time followers will recall that a hof is a low-lying field or meadow. This is where the battle took place, and the Geordies would pronounce this as Philiphof, but the local people here call it Philiphawk. The battle at Philiphoff was roughly where the cricket and rugby field is today, and was one of the battles fought during the War of the Three Kingdoms. That war was begun by Charles I with his insistence on religious reforms and his autocratic ideas. It began with the Bishops' Wars of 1639 and 1640. Then the Irish Rebellion of 1641 and the English Civil Wars in 1642 and beyond. The Battle of Philiphoff was fought in 1645 between the Royalists led by the Marquis of Montrose and the Covenanters' army led by Sir David Leslie. James Graham, the Marquis of Montrose, had initially been a Covenanter and served in David Leslie's army until 1639, when he had become a Royalist and supporter of Charles I after a meeting with the King. In the June of 1645, King Charles had been defeated at the Battle of Naseby in Yorkshire by Oliver Cromwell. Montrose was on his way to help the King, stopping in Selkirk overnight to rest. David Leslie was dispatched to stop Montrose reaching the King and stumbled across him camped at Selkirk. The Highland contingent had deserted Montrose, leaving him with only a few followers. Leslie and his army advanced along the river underneath the town on the hill and got past the Marquis and his cavalry to spring a surprise dawn attack on his infantry still sleeping. The Marquis, hearing the battle cries, arrived at the field with his cavalry to find his infantry slaughtered and consequently fled the field. Most were caught and executed, as was Leslie's way. Peace returned to Ettrick Valley following the battle, and then the woolen industry arrived in the 1700s. The first mill was established in 1767, producing yarn for a company in Musselburgh. The mills expanded gradually, and by 1869, 7 mills here in Selkirk employed over 1,000 people. Although the textile industry declined after the two world wars, the industry is still alive in Selkirk. One of the most renowned weavers in the borders, Loch Carron of Scotland, still produce tartan in the town. A visitor centre is housed adjacent to the factory. The mill receives wool from several sources, including Scotland and England. This room houses the tanks that the wool is dyed in. After dyeing and spinning, the yarn is woven into 7,000 tartan designs currently available at Loch Carron Mills. The mill provides tartan for clients worldwide.
I'm looking for knots, which sometimes there's a few, sometimes there's not so many.
If your family or clan have a tartan, the cloth can be woven for you in shorter runs. The mill also provides a service where you can design your own tartan, as the possibilities are endless. Loch Carron Mills also offer a bespoke tailor to make your chosen garment from scratch, be that a kilt, a jacket, or a wedding outfit. My personal thanks to the management and staff for allowing me to film. Selkirk is a busy, bustling town with several visitor attractions. Halliwell's House Museum stands in a street along with some buildings over 400 years old. The museum charts the history of Selkirk, but also some of the personal stories of people who played a significant role in the town's history. Sir Walter Scott, who lived a few miles away, was the sheriff here, and the courthouse has been preserved as it was in his day, as another attraction to see. My personal thanks to Live Borders and the Scottish Borders Council for allowing filming in both museums. At Philiphoff there is a salmon viewing centre where you can view the salmon making their way up the river to spawn. Like many of the border towns, there is plenty to see and do in this culture-rich region with spectacular scenery as its backdrop. As Ettrick Water passes beneath the town, high up on the hill, it is crossed by the main A707 and two footbridges. One of the footbridges is sited where an older bridge built in 1738 once stood and carried the main A708 into Selkirk along Bridge Street and over the river. It was washed away in the flood of 1777. A year later, a new bridge was built which had 4 stone arches. The A708 was diverted to meet the A707 at Lingley Road and then crossed the river into Selkirk. It was widened in 1800 to carry the increased traffic due to the mills, and stood until 1977, when it too was washed away. The new Selkirk Bridge was built in 1981 and bridges the river in one span, so lessening the chance of flood damage in the future. The final 2 miles of the river to its confluence, Ettrick Water, is equally as wide and deep as the Tweed. But before the river meets the Tweed, it passes under Ettrick Lindeen Bridge, built in 1831 by the same builder as the old Tweed Bridge crossing the Tweed. The road which passes through Selkirk is the A7 today, but was formerly the old Turnpike Road linking Carlisle to Edinburgh. Back then it crossed the Ettrick here, and then in less than a mile it had to cross the Tweed as well before entering Galashiels. The new A7 bridge crosses the Tweed below the confluence and so only needs to cross the one river. The confluence is quite a dramatic junction set between the old Tweed Bridge and the new A7 bridge, with architecture centuries apart, the meeting of 2 mighty rivers seamlessly merging into one. Well, that's all, folks, for this particular episode. If you've enjoyed it, then please give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already done that, and keep supporting the channel in whatever way that you can. And you can do that by passing on the video link to one friend or one family member. Try and get that friend or family member to subscribe to the channel, because that helps as well. Those of you who can afford or willing to financially contribute to the channel, then go to the PayPal link at the top of my homepage and make a small donation of £1 or £2. That all helps. And of course, as I keep saying, the best way that you can help the channel is to watch the programme right through to the end until all the titles have gone off the screen and the last bar of the music is played, because only then do YouTube count that as a view. Otherwise, if you switch off when the titles start to go up or before that, it doesn't count, and that obviously isn't helpful to the channel. Anyway, having said all of that, I wish you all the very best that life has to offer, the very best of health, and I'll see you all again extremely soon in the next episode. But for now, it's goodbye.